Ah yes, it has been, as of today's date, about 1 year since I've started playing games on computer. Over this period of time, I encountered many trials, terrors, and of course, also got some triumphs. Yeah! It's over! Which is why I've decided that today I will rank all achievements that I've grabbed over this time frame. Now, just to put out any potential confusions, let me tell you what I count as an achievement. An achievement is, for this video's purpose, a beaten knight, challenge, or a boss in a game. Under these, I will mostly exclude things that are just a different challenge with less. As an example, when I have beaten 1020 mode and 1120 mode, I will just choose the harder of the two. This doesn't include modes that have clear differences between themselves or where the additions of one thing changes the gameplay to a very drastic extent. If there's a strategy that makes the challenge a lot easier, I will, depending on the situation, let it go into the ranking by quite a bit. This doesn't include cases where you skip the entire gameplay loop. I also took speedruns out of this because, in my opinion, they fall into a completely different category on which one day I might make a separate video on. But now that all of this is out of the way, welcome to the ranking. I hope you'll enjoy. Well, after all of this intro, let's start with the F tier. These challenges are the bottom of the barrel in difficulty. I in fact believe that anyone with even the smallest amount of skill can beat the contents of this tier. So, who amongst these is the easiest? Well, amongst all of them, I personally think that the easiest by a mile is Oblatus Casa 1.0 Slenderman. This quote-unquote challenge is so easy, in fact, that when I started making the list, it was no joke the first thing that got placed. The one objective in this challenge is to collect the 8 notes that are scattered across the walls. That probably sounds hard, until you realize that you can just do what I'm doing on screen and easily cover every position. As if that wasn't bad enough, it is also where we have 1.0 Slenderman, who is the easiest enemy on the entire list. He will appear on one side of the room and kill you if you are A, dumb enough to click on him, or B, when you stare at him for too long. Now, how long is too long? Well, multiple seconds. Fair point, that might seem fast, until you realize that because you are already spinning, you never actually spend any time looking at him, which makes him a joke. Also, this is one of the creepypasta challenges, which means that essentially anyone can beat it easily in under 4 minutes. Basically, if you understand the concept of walking in zigzags, this is the easiest thing by far. Now, let's move on to our second lowest spot, which goes to Oblatus Casa 1.0 Jeff the Killer. Whilst this challenge dodged last place by virtue of not having this, it didn't get far anyways. You see, in this challenge, you have to turn on your cameras whilst not dying to Jeff. So why is this easy? Because Jeff quite literally doesn't kill you as long as you stand still. Now, he does after entering pause your camera progress, but you can kinda just turn the progress back on. Yeah, in all honesty, there is one reason that this isn't last, which is that this challenge takes about 10 whole minutes to beat. That makes it the second longest thing on the entire list and makes it very easy to just get greedy. From one grinning bastard to another, we have at 18th place Oblatus Casa 1.0 Smile Dog. I could honestly see an argument made for him being one place higher due to him being the only F tier that doesn't have literally one-dimensional gameplay. To complete this challenge, your task is to erase Smiledog's face from your notepad. Every now and then, the picture will start to regenerate itself, after which you have to find and flash Smiledog or go in the attic if he isn't on the cameras. Now, whilst this is a cool mode, I will be honest, the execution of these ideas is way too easy. The notepad can be erased way too quickly for being your only objective, the time you have to find Smiledog is honestly massive, and him going into the attic is rare enough that a lot of times he will just never do it. This is almost certainly harder than the 2 spots below it, but that's honestly the only thing I can really give it. Now, so that we can finally round out F tier, we have Oblitus Casa 1.0 Eyeless Jack. This challenge consists of you running around this almost black labyrinth where you have to take 5 pictures of Jack. The best strategy for myself and probably most people when playing this is to go into the northwestern corner, wait till your screen turns completely black and then take a photo. There are 3 reasons why even with such a simple concept, this is above the previous. First of all, it can sometimes be very hard to tell the difference between the normal screen and the pitch black screen. Second of all, this strategy is a bit luck reliant. And third of all, the intended way of doing this is kinda stupid, which bumps it up by a bit. These reasons combine to me putting it above the rest, but not any higher. Ah yes, we have finally reached the D tier. This tier is no joke and a massive step up in difficulty, which includes the first challenges I could actually see myself dying to, even if it's not common. Here we have, after 4 creepypasta challenges back to back, finally something else. That being my 16th place, 5 Nights at Candy's free custom night, Shadowcat Easy with Hard Cassette and Classic Cat. In this night, we have to fend off both Classic Cat and Shadowcat. So let's talk about both. Classic Cat will appear on either end of your bed, where you have to shine at him until he goes away and switches to the other side. Shadowcat on the other end is a bit more complicated. He will start below your bed. There you have to check what side he is on before then leaving. After doing that, you need to, after the ambience he plays gets louder, go to the other side of your bed and wait till you hear a sound cue so that you can shine your light at him. Then when you shine on him, he will repeatedly try to avoid your light, which is when you have to keep your light on him to not die. After doing that for a bit, Shadowcat will move to the other side where you have to repeat this process one more time. When you don't die whilst doing this, he'll go under the bed for around 30 seconds before attacking again. These two are, as already mentioned, paired with the add-on Hard Cassette, which makes you die when not using your cassette for long enough. It also makes the night always last 8 whole minutes, which puts it on the high end of time in a night. Whilst all of this might sound really hard, it is honestly completely manageable once you understand the mechanics. I essentially always do a loop of using the cassette, checking on Shadowcat and making sure that Classic Cat is in the right spot before then dealing with Shadowcat. After that, I just deal with Classic Cat one more time and repeat the loop. Doing this is super consistent and in all honesty not too hard, which is why this doesn't place any higher than D tier. Speaking of not placing higher than D tier, let's look at our first placement in the top 15, which, guess what, is another creepypasta challenge, this time being Oblitus Casa 2.0 Smile Dog. This is the only creepypasta challenge that didn't get any form of new gameplay in 2.0. What Smiledog got instead in 2.0 was a massive increase to the difficulty of every single mechanic. Smiledog now gives you way less time to erase the notepad, goes into the attic more than once in a blue moon, and, most importantly of all, has to be flashed 3 whole times before going away. Whilst the notepad does regenerate slower now, that is only to balance out how much more time you now spend looking for Smiledog. This update is in my opinion multiple times harder than 1.0 and perfectly shows the massive difference between F and D tier. It sadly isn't enough for me to go any higher, which is partially because this challenge is still really short. Still a massive step up though. We have, after 6 previous entries, now finally reached the C tier. This is where I place the challenges that required me to use a moderate amount of skill and which I didn't just beat in a few throwaway attempts. This tier starts with the last short challenge on the list, which is Oblitus Casa 2.0 Jeff the Killer. In 2.0 Jeff the Killer, your goal is like in 1.0 to turn every single camera on. For the first 3 to 4 cameras, the classic strategies of not moving still works. This changes, however, after you turn on the 4th camera. If after that point Jeff enters your room, then you just die. That basically forces you to activate the cameras next to your office and check where Jeff is gonna attack from so that you can flash him. Now, this would be really simple if your light wasn't insanely limited, meaning that you have to play this as quickly as possible to survive. There is, however, a cost Jeff had to pay for all of this, being that the night now only lasts about sad 4 minutes. That reason alone makes it similar to all the other short challenges possible to just get a lucky run and win, which is why this sadly didn't make it past a low C tier. There he is followed up by my 13th spot, Oblitus Casa 1.0 Night 5 with only cameras 2, 3 and 4. In Night 5 we have to deal with Mick and Corrupted Face. Mick has to be kept away from your office. You do that by playing a lure in the room next to her if she has no eyes, or by flashing her if she has eyes. Every now and then she will also go into the attic after playing a shuffling noise. She is paired up with the face, who will appear about once a minute. You will there have to put your lighter on him multiple times to make him leave. These two will be supported by the notepad, which has to be erased, and Mick's shadow, which has to be flashed on the cameras. After 3 AM, we can use the camera for a few seconds, in which Mick turns into a second stage. That second stage makes her a lot faster, but doesn't change anything else. This gameplay is paired with the challenge of only using the 3 cameras closest to your office. That means that I can only watch these 3 cameras, and that I have to keep her there. All of that might sound like an insanely hard challenge, yet I still put it only at my 13th spot. That's because pulling this off isn't even remotely as tight as it might sound. You can in fact easily just get into a loop of checking your notepad until she leaves camera 2 and putting her back into camera 2. The face does force you to break this loop, but it surprisingly doesn't really matter because Mick, contrary to popular belief, isn't really that fast. She, even in her second stage, gives you like multiple seconds of room when facing the attic. I actually almost placed this a spot lower, even though I overall decided against it, due to there being a bit of an RNG factor that changed how quickly you had to be with getting Mick back to Cam 2. After looking at Mick, let's round out the C tier with Oblitus Casa 2.0 Eyeless Jack. In this challenge, we, like in 1.0, have to take 5 photos of Jack. That's where the similarities end, however, because in 2.0 it is a lot easier to track Jack's footsteps when compared to 1.0. Jack, to balance this, however, now forces you to get extremely close to him before taking a picture. This can easily backfire and get you killed by walking into him. It's also here important to get pictures carefully because taking a picture from too far away actually leads to you losing Jack and getting chased. This makes the corner strategy basically obsolete and encourages you to chase him. So yeah, I personally find having to listen and time every photo correctly a good chunk harder than the placements below it, which is why even with the gameplay's simple nature, it places at the top of C tier. We have finally arrived at the B tier, which starts off with Treasure Island 2020, Night 6, no second guessing. In Night 6, we face off against Hourglass. He will start at one of 5 different cameras from which he will make his way to your office. After he appears in your office, you have to stay still when he starts in cam 5 or 8, shut off a camera when he starts in cam 3 or 4, or turn off the lights when he starts in cam 9. If you choose the correct option, he will leave and take one of the 5 spots again, which repeats the cycle. On top of dealing with him, I also beat this with the extra challenge of no second guessing. This basically means that I can't change my defensive option when used long enough to get rid of him, and that I can only use one defensive option at once. Now, as you'd probably expect from a mode with a singular threat, the gameplay loop is quite simple. You first check the 2 turning off cameras and then the lights out camera. If he's on neither, you know that you'll have to stand still. After that, make sure to save as much power as possible by turning the light slowly off and on before then dealing with him. This night is difficult because Hourglass will every single in-game hour become faster and faster until at 4 and 5 AM he gives you mere seconds to find him before he's on his way. That alone makes this challenge hard enough to be the start of B tier, even though it still isn't any higher. Now, after many placements, we have finally gotten to the last creepypasta challenge on the entire list. That's right, jumping from last place in its 1.0 version, now we have Oblitus Casa 2.0 Slenderman. This challenge requires you to collect all 8 notes, which are placed in the sideways corridors, vertical corridors, and in the safe room to the northwest. Whilst collecting these notes, you are also constantly attacked by Slenderman, who still kills you when being around him for too long. Now, the difference between this and 1.0 is that this version of Slenderman is a lot better at putting himself into your way. This entails him being insanely aggressive, being able to teleport around the place, and even being able to chase the player under rare occasions. All that aggressive behavior, paired with the massive amount of places that the notes can spawn at, leads to this challenge taking me on average about 11 minutes to complete, which for now makes it the longest thing on the entire list. Editor's note, what I just said wasn't quite correct. You see, there are 2 ways to beat this challenge. The first method is a bit easier but takes longer, and the second method is harder whilst not being as long. I'm saying this because the challenge taking 11 minutes is only really true for the first method. That makes my comment not accurate anymore because recently I beat Slenderman using the second and slightly harder route, which would be the one in the finished list. Doesn't change the placement, but makes my time comment outdated. Just wanted to let you know. So yeah, the length of the mode, aggression of Slenderman, and difficulty in actually finding the notes all combined to making this, even under its simplicity, the first mode to reach the top 10 for now. Let's celebrate passing the last creepypasta challenge by talking about a game that has been left in the dust since 16th place. That's right, coming up as our 9th place we have Five Nights at Candy's Free But Better, Shadow Rat with Classic Cat and Hard Cassette. This challenge features, as the name implies, Shadow Rat and Classic Cat. Seeing I already talked about Classic Cat, let's just jump to Shadow Rat. He will, after playing a knocking sound, start in one of your doorways or in the locker. If you there take too long to find him, or if you find him off too much, he will appear in your room. There, you hold your flashlight constantly on him until he goes under your bed. Under the bed, he pretty much functions in the same way as Shadowcat, where you will have to check for a side and drift over after he plays his sound cue. When doing all of that correctly, he will go back from where he originally came. Now, the reason that this is so much harder than Shadowcat is that dealing with all of his steps takes really long, which means that leaving Classic Cat unattended will always lead to you dying. The only way to prevent this from happening is dealing with Classic Cat in the about 10 seconds that Shadow Rat is under the bed. Doing this can super easily backfire when not done fast enough and always leads to a tricky situation. Having to deal with this tricky situation every time that Shadow Rat appeared is, in all honesty, what turned this otherwise not too impressive mode into something that triumphed over every single creepypasta challenge, which grants it a respectable position on the list. If you're already missing Shadow Rat, then don't sweat, because he already returns for our 8th spot, Five Nights at Candy's Free But Better, Shadow Rat and Shadow Cat with Hard Cassette. Here you deal with both Shadow Rat and Shadow Cat, whom's mechanic I already gave their own entries on. Having both of the main cast on leads to, as you'd probably expect, the night being about constantly dealing with their respective room sections, which leads to many opportunities to mess up and die. Here's the deal, however. Even though, yes, having both on does make the challenge harder, it also allows for a loop which makes beating this very, very consistent. Said loop consists of checking Shadowcat, stalling Shadow Rat, dealing with Shadowcat, and dealing with Shadow Rat. These 4 steps can be repeated forever and always work whilst still giving the player more than enough time to deal with the hard cassette. Now, this alone of course didn't make it placed below the other 2 challenges, but absolutely is the reason that I couldn't see myself putting this any higher, which is why 8th place is this mode's limit. I hope you are missing Obletus Casa, because our 7th place and finale in B tier is Obletus Casa 1.0 1120 mode. This mode features an astounding 11 plus 1 characters that can be split up into 4 different groups. The first group consists of threats on your cameras like Willy and Dippy, who have to be lured away from your office, and Photonegative Mini, who has to be flashed back. The second and smallest group consists of the Face and Pete, who both appear in your attic after playing a knocking or shuffling noise. The Face is dealt with by shining your lighter at him, and Pete is dealt with by just leaving the attic. Both groups are supported by the third group, which consists of characters that make the act of dealing with these 2 a bit harder. This group includes Daisy, who temporarily disables the camera when looked at for too long, Corruptus, who kills you when you stare at his illusions too often, and Slester, who just messes with your vision. There's on top of that also the 4th and largest group, which consists of characters that have to be dealt with in your office. Those are Photonegative Mickey and Oswald, for which you will have to shut off a camera, Inkblot Mick, who forces you to blink, and Belial, who has to be erased from your notepad. Now, the way that you deal with all of this madness is surprisingly simple. Your main priority in this night is keeping Willy and Dippy in camera 2, whilst also consistently erasing your notepad. If they disappear, you will just have to lure them back, and if Minnie shows up, you will have to flash her. This has to be simply looped until A, one of the 3 remaining office threats shows up, or B, until someone appears in the attic. When one of these things happen, just deal with the respective threat before returning to the loop as usual. That is surprisingly already it, and would have probably been a place lower if it wasn't for a certain factor. Basically, when, as you're going into the attic, one of these 3 guys shows up, then it's literally unsurvivable, which forces you to learn the few times that you have to wait before going into the attic. This adds a bit of absolutely unnecessary inconsistency and gave this mode just enough to put it as the top of B tier. We have passed 14 different challenges and successfully reached the A tier, which includes things that I, even now, still consider difficult. There it starts with my first ever hardest being Treasure Island 2020 True Nightmare. This mode puts you up against 13 different characters. 10 out of these 13 are thankfully dealt with by only using one of the 3 main mechanics. They are Oswald, Photonegative Mickey, Classic Photonegative Mickey, Impurity and Disembodied, who all require a camera to be shut off, a Syphilis and Undying, who require you to stand still, and the Face, Photonegative Mascot, and Sparky, who require you to turn the lights off. The last 3 characters are also not too difficult, being Classic Face, who requires you to put up the monitor, Willy, who just can't be looked at, and Pete, who is dealt with by changing to the camera that he's on. Now, the hardest thing about this mode are when these characters start overlapping, and the balance between saving your power and preserving your cameras. As you might remember from the Hourglass segment, the only way to save power is turning off the lights. This sadly has the side effect of halving the recharge speed of your cameras, which, I'll be honest, isn't really a big deal whilst playing the game normally. Here it is a big deal, however, because you have 5 characters on max difficulty that all require a cam to be shut off. Now, with all of that in mind, I'd say that the most consistent strategy of doing this is saving as much power as possible until 1 AM, before then keeping the lights out to an absolute minimum. Whilst doing that, just deal with the threats as they come in, and also make sure to keep an eye on Pete. Doing this still forces you to deal with some quite tricky situations when multiple kinds of threats overlap, and doesn't make the camera problem fully go away, which all combine to this being a very fit candidate to start off A tier. Set A tier gets already capped off by our, for now, first entry in the top 5, Five Nights at Candy's Free But Better, Puppet Master Heart. This mode throws us against one enemy, being Monster Vinny. He will, like Shadow Rat, start in one of your 3 entrances, where you get the opportunity to stall his encounter for a bit. After about 35 seconds, he will be fast enough to enter pretty much guaranteed, which is when the main part of the night starts. There, he will do the same bedroom gameplay that both Shadow Cat and Shadow Rat do. His version of the segment has, however, a lot more positions that he can go into and is more strict, which makes dying here a lot easier. Now, if you manage to beat the segment, then Vinny will, instead of going under your bed, do this funny walk to the side before doing the segment again. He will do this 3 more times before then, after 4 full cycles, finally going under your bed. There, you do the classic strategy of checking on him and going to the correct side until he does his audio cue. After all of that, you shine your light on him and do all of this a second and then a 3rd time before actually getting him out of your bedroom. This finally gives you, after just under 3 minutes of gameplay, some breathing room until he starts his madness for the 2nd and final time. I was honestly close to giving this mode an S tier, and even though it's very close, the fact that you only have to actually worry about him for about 4.5 minutes, paired with there being nothing external to learn, just barely made Vinny miss out on S tier. It has certainly been a ride, and we have reached the big guns in S tier. Every single mode in this tier took me at least 1.5 hours, or in most cases even longer to beat. Now, the first placement in this pretty massive tier is Five Nights at Candy's 3-bit beta, Monstergami Night. This mode throws you against the Monstergami cat, who will start in the middle of your room, where you will have to flash him in a similar vein to Shadow Rat or Shadow Cat. This is however much more difficult because Monstergami is so massive that the camera doesn't lock onto him at all, which, as you might have guessed, makes the segment a lot more awkward. Now, he will, if you manage to even despite that flash him enough, start running from one point in your room to another. There you follow his movement multiple times before he finally settles down, which makes you do the bedroom segment again. Then he will, after repeating this a 2nd and last time, go under your bed. You will there have to use the time where he isn't in your office to start playing your cassette tape. Playing said tape can only be done when Monstergami is under the bed, has to be stopped after he goes back into your room, and is forced to beat the night. This ends up meaning that you have to deal with Monstergami about 7 separate times. Over these, he will become faster and faster whilst also starting to dodge your flashlight ever more commonly, which results in the last couple of cycles looking like this. So yeah, Monstergami Night is pretty tough overall, but honestly did actually end up getting its S tier due to the sheer difficulty in the last couple of cycles. I was honestly close to giving this mode an S tier. The fact that you only have to actually worry about him for about 4.5 minutes, being nothing external to learn, made Vinny miss out on S tier. You wouldn't believe it, but Vinny actually returns in the 3rd spot, Five Nights at Candy's 3-bit beta, Shadow Master Easy with hard cassette. Here we face off against Shadow Vinny, who will spawn in your room, where he gives you just enough time to start a cassette before engaging with him. He will, once engaged, start the all too classic bat sequence, which is slightly more forgiving and a lot more tricky than when the Puppet Master does it. Shadow Vinny can in set sequence slowly turn when shined at, and instead of changing between one of his 10 positions, straight up rotate in a 360-degree circle. This mode is also split into 2 stages. The first of these stages is from the beginning of the night all the way until Shadow Vinny goes under your bed at 3 AM. Shadow Vinny is here surprisingly not the main threat. The actual main threat of this stage is your add-on hard cassette, because Shadow Vinny doesn't allow you to fully rewind your cassette, which, trust me, leads to many hard cassette related casualties. Included in those is also Shadow Vinny's bed sequence, because you have to, a few seconds before Vinny comes up from the bed, go back and put your tape back on playing. This is difficult because stopping your rewind too early leads to the tape running out before you can do all of Vinny's cycles, but returning to play your tape too late gets you killed when Vinny returns to your room. Now, the timing of locking in your tape isn't really that strict, but has to be done completely blind without any cues whatsoever, which turns a fairly relaxing section into an incredibly stressful endeavor that will cause at least a couple of deaths. If you do, however, get past the hard cassette struggles and manage to get Vinny under the bed at 3 AM, then you get to experience the second stage of this night. Here, the hard cassette becomes pretty much a non-issue, and Shadow Vinny becomes the star of the show for 2 reasons. The first reason is that Vinny will at this point do way more full spins whilst also being less forgiving, which pretty much makes his kill timer replace the hard cassette. The second reason is that 3 AM is where Shadow Vinny gets a completely new under the bed sequence where, instead of starting at one of the 2 sides, he starts in the middle. This forces you to do a cycle under the bed, which for some reason heavily nerfs his hurt box whilst still having the exact same kill timer as usual, which leads to this easily being the hardest part of the entire night, whilst having to be done 3 separate times. You also might have noticed that Shadow Vinny not just directly starts in your room, but also that he never leaves, which ends up meaning that you, over the entire 8 minutes that this mode goes on for, never get to take a breather. Having this constant difficulty is what, at least for now, makes me put Shadow Vinny all the way up here into the top 3. The next entry on the list is the highest placing challenge in both Oblitus Casa versions, which is Oblitus Casa 2.0 Night 6. This night is the evolution of Mikmik's boss fight and features Face, Mikmik, her shadow, and the notepad, who are all buffed tremendously. These buffs are that your notepad fills up a lot faster than in Night 5, that Mikmik's shadow appears on every second camera flip, that the face is so common that he might as well be omnipresent, and most infamously of all, that Mikmik starts in a harder version of Phase 2 that can quite literally speedrun your entire camera system in 14 seconds. All of these things force you to pretty much optimize the night as well as possible, which looks like this. First, you have to put Mikmik into camera 5, 7 or 9, then you have to deal with the face. After that, you just simply have to erase your notepad and finally go to camera 6 when you put her in camera 5/7, or check camera 4 and then 3 when you put her in cam 9. You'll also have to keep track of your 2.0 limited fuel, which will run out on at least one of these cameras, forcing you to switch up where you keep Mikmik. Now, all of this gameplay might honestly not sound too difficult, which it mechanically isn't, because the true difficulty of this night comes in the speed that is required to win. The face, as an example, requires pretty much perfect muscle memory, and the notepad has to be erased at a very, very high speed if you even want to have a shot at catching Mikmik fast enough. This speed-related difficulty, however, only actually lasts whilst dealing with these 2 and completely drops off whilst pushing back Mikmik, which paired with the, for this part of the list, fairly low night time of only 6 minutes, combined to Oblitus Casa's 6th night, just barely missing out on a higher placement. Wow, you're still here! And I think it's finally time, after over half an hour, to reveal the highest spot on the entire original list. This legendary spot is given to Five Nights at Treasure Island but dumb 1320 mode. You might look at this roster and ask, why is it so much harder than regular 1320? And the answer to that question is that Fnati but dumb straight up buffs or changes almost every single character. So let's not waste any more time and talk about every single one of these 13 little demons. Willy the Face and Classic Face pretty much work the exact same as usual. Syphilis and Undying appear way more often and now force you to stand still in the same direction that they appear at. Oswald now forces you to stand still as well. Pete requires you to actually watch the camera that he's on. Disembodied forces you to turn something, on the side that he spawns, off, whilst also completely disabling your lights and the ability to stand still. And Sparky is an annoying brat who needs you to first stand still with lights off, before then, after he leaves, requiring a camera to be shut off. Now, all of that shouldn't sound too bad so far, because these 9 pretty much are the supporting threads of the remaining 4. They are Hourglass, who, even though he's locked at his 1 AM aggression, still is a massive problem. Photonegative Mascot, who appears insanely commonly and who forces you to rapidly move from side to side. Editor's note, hi, I'm back. Undying as Syphilis and Photonegative Mascot being the only more common characters is simply not true, because every single character except Hourglass and Willy appears much more often than in True Nightmare. Don't know why I thought that when writing the script and just wanted to clear that up. Back to the video. Impurity, who forces you to have your turned off camera there where she is, and Classic Photonegative Mickey, who can spawn at one of 4 different cameras where you have to find him and remember where he is, because you'll have to, after he spawns, turn the camera off that he started on. With all of that said, the quote-unquote strategy to beat this basically just consists of constantly warding off your threats, whilst also checking for Hourglass and Classic Photonegative Mickey so that you can deal with them after they appear. Remember, however, that you, whilst constantly being under attack, have to constantly keep in mind where Classic Photonegative Mickey is, what Hourglass is doing, if Pete is attacking, Sparky's absolutely silly second mechanic, and that after every time you turn off a camera, Impurity has to be dealt with. You'll most likely, if at any point you dare to forget even about one of these mechanics, die, which as always resets you all the way back to square one. This brutal memory aspect paired with the already stressful enhanced gameplay that this mode features made 1320 absolutely deservedly get the highest position of any original modes, and it honestly wasn't even remotely close at all. Yep, the cat is out of the bag, because there is, even after covering the first place, still a good chunk of the video remaining. This is because there were a hand total of 10 achievements that I beat too late for them to end in the finished script, which is why I'm adding them here. Now, I will for these remaining challenges not just show their spot on the list, but also what's the hardest challenge that they place above, and in what tier they ended up landing, because it might otherwise be pretty hard to track in what range of difficulty something actually placed. With all of that out of the way, let's jump all the way back into C tier, where the first extra challenge is Phobia the Awakening, Night 6 without Captain Feathersword ever leaving his camera. This night throws us against 4 different threats. They are Captain Feathersword, Jimmy the Elf, Mark, and the Figure. Captain Feathersword resides in camera 6, where, for this challenge, he has to be constantly watched. Jimmy the Elf sits in front of your desk, where you will have to shock him when he gets too close. The Figure appears in one of your vents and forces you to shut where he's present. And Mark appears in one of your 2 hallways, where he will shortly after showing up teleport into your office, which forces you to put on your mask and stare at him. These mechanics lead to you playing the night by first checking for Captain Feathersword and the Figure, after which you just check both sides for Mark, and then already repeat the loop. Outside of that, if Jimmy gets into a second to last or last stage, you shock him, and if Mark shows up, you just use your mask. This is, and I will not deny that, really stressful at first, until you realize just how short this gameplay loop actually is. If you in fact quite literally only master the couple of seconds that were previously mentioned, then you have pretty much mastered it all. Pair that with the existing gameplay being surprisingly lenient, and you probably see why there's no way that this places anywhere above a C tier. After that, let's jump all the way into B tier, where the 9th bonus spot is Junior's Night 6, no checkpoints. This night is split into 2 completely different segments. The first segment throws us against Bonnie, Chica, Freddy, Foxy, Balloon Baby, and the puppets. Bonnie, Chica, and Freddy come from your side vents or the front corridor and force you to use your mask. Balloon Baby requires you, after playing 4 laughing sounds, to use your mask as well. Foxy appears sometimes in the middle, where he has to be flashed multiple times, and the puppet sits in the prize corner, where he forces you to wind up its music box. If you survive against these guys for long enough, then a cutscene on your conveyor belt starts playing, which begins the second segment of this night. Here we face the Ghost, the Mangle, and her Owltail. The Ghost appears randomly on one of the cameras, where she forces you to quickly find and then flash her. The Mangle will wander every now and then into your hallway, where she has to be fully shined at, and the Owltail appears after a sound cue in one of the vents, which forces you to put on your mask and look at the side that it emerged from. For the first stage, you want to switch between winding your box and flashing the hall, whilst dealing with Chica, Bonnie, and Foxy when they appear. Whilst doing that, you also want to fully focus on winding the music if you see Freddy in the hallway, before dealing with him after he forces your camera down. For the second stage, you want to check a few cameras at a time for the Ghost, and consistently flash the hallways, whilst also dealing with the Owltail when it appears. Do this till the end of the night whilst not getting too greedy, and you should be able to beat this segment as well. I'd overall say that this mode is pretty hard, but honestly nothing too special. The nighttime is pretty long and there is a good bit to learn, but most of the time, especially when it comes to putting your mask on, this night isn't really that strict and really just forces you to consistently keep a cool head, which is the main reason that this night 6 didn't place any higher. Also not being too strict is our next bonus spot, Tycoon Sun's Custom Night Deluxe 1022 mode. This challenge throws us against 8 consistent and 2 shifting characters. The 8 consistent characters keep the same mechanic over the entire night. They are the 3 regular Chippomats who appear at your window and require the curtains to be shut, Funfungal, who also appears at your window and who must be flashed a lot, Phantom Chippomat, who steals the flashlight power when you turn the lights off, Toy, who every now and then must be checked at the bed, Springcrab, who you have to flash at the front door, and Rockstar Biddy, who must be avoided on the minimap. The 2 shifting characters change the mechanic over the night from one thing to another. These are Nightmare Chippomat, who first works like Springcrab before later getting inside, forcing you to flash him 75 times, and Monster Shroom, who first randomly appears at one of the entrances, before later wandering around at the front map, where he behaves like Rockstar Biddy. Now, you might have realized this yourself, but outside of the wandering enemies and how fast you flash, there isn't really anything that is difficult to execute. This is because the main challenge of this mode comes in you managing these threats. You can't, as an example, deal with Toy at the same time as someone like the Chippomats or Springcrab, which means that you constantly have to check every one of the 4 different positions, and that you have to decide what is in need of immediate checking and what isn't. This quick decision making can be very overwhelming without proper strategy, which paired with you later having to find some time to get the flashes on Nightmare Chippomat, made 1022 just barely edge to its current spot on the list. Our next entry goes back to an all too familiar game and is Oblitus Casa 2.0 Limbo. Limbo puts us against 6 characters that are known as the Shades. They are Photonegative Mickey and Oswald, who both require you to stab the doll to your right, a Syphilis, who has to be shined at on your sides, Impurity, who appears in your office and requires you to quickly look at your camera, Sadie, who kills you when you're poking your doll too much, and Disembodied, who corrupts the collectible Mickey heads so that you get stunned when clicking on them. These enemies on their own aren't really that hard to deal with, which is because you, whilst being attacked, have to collect 50 of these white Mickey heads on the cameras to win. This is best done by looking in 2 to 3 cameras before checking both sides. Repeat this until you A, find a Mickey head, or B, have the need to deal with an enemy, where you obviously do the thing that is needed against the attacker. Now, this probably isn't a shocker, but because of how often you have to repeat this one loop, it makes the night insanely long, whilst not giving you any time to breathe, which makes the chance of just once getting greedy, randomly messing up, or reacting too slowly a lot more likely, and leads to Limbo requiring you to be very consistent at both finding the heads and playing the loop. Set length and required consistency is the reason that Limbo, even with the very simple nature of its gameplay, plays to where it's currently at. It honestly sounds unbelievable, but even when adding the bonus segments, we have successfully made it into the top 10 again, where it is an amazing time to introduce one of the last not yet shown games and its corresponding challenge, Five Nights at Chuck E. Cheese Revived 820 mode. Here, we face off against Mr. Munch, who appears in the front corridor and requires your gate to be fully shut, Chuck E. Cheese, who kills you when shining the corridor 3 times whilst he's there and otherwise behaves like Mr. Munch, Jasper, Helen Henry, and Pizza Time Helen, who all appear in one of the 3 entrances and require you to quickly shut a door on them, Mysterious Pasquale, who forces you to simply look at your camera, Pizza Time Jasper, who very commonly appears in your hallway and requires a ton of repeated flashes, and Pizza Time Pasquale, who once a night stops the approach of every other enemy, after which you have to find him on the cameras and hold the disable button until he leaves. Now, gameplay wise, you throughout the entire night want to check all 3 entrance cameras before giving your corridor a flash. Whilst doing that, it is however important to prioritize certain enemies over others. Basically, you want to first deal with any threats at your 3 entrances, then shine your lights down your corridor once, then deal with the hallway enemies, and last, deal with Pizza Time Jasper when multiple enemies appear together. It is outside of that also important to give Pizza Time Jasper only a couple of slow flashes in between you checking cycles. Because if you deal with Jasper in one go by spam flashing him, it can very easily end in you instantly getting mobbed when Chuck E. Cheese decides to merely spawn in your hallway. With all of that said, I'd overall say that 820 is a simply difficult mode. It has very strict kill timers on some of the cast, forces the player into tricky situations, and pretty much constantly leaves you with something to do. Even with that though, I personally never ended up really struggling with it that much, which is basically the sole reason that it sadly didn't make S and just barely ended at the very top of A tier. It looks like we are slowly but surely approaching the home stretch because everything that's to remain resides in the S tier. There, it starts with a pretty unusual mode, which is Treasure Island 2020 Infinite Night, 4,620 points. Here, we face the entire roster from all the way back in True Nightmare, minus Impurity, and with classic photonegative Mickey about 60% slower. This easier roster might seem strange on a mode that places in, you know, this tier, until you realize that to get to the previously mentioned score, you must survive for 12 whole in-game hours instead of the usual 6. Now, the game in all fairness, to make this even remotely possible, does give you a handful of percentages power at every time the clock ticks over. These small boosts are nice, but even under perfect managing play, don't fully make up for your general lost power, which sounds really bad, but in theory helps a ton and makes reaching 12 AM still not too bad if, again, you're doing perfect power management. Set perfect power management, however, is sadly just simply not possible because turning your lights off, as I've already mentioned on the True Nightmare segment, makes the recharge on your camera slower, which means that when managing your power perfectly, you always run out of cameras too quickly and immediately die once any one of these guys appears. Couple this management where you have to save power just good enough that you don't run out of cameras as well, with there still being actual almost A tier worthy threats to deal with, and a night length of 14 very, very painful minutes, and it should make sense how 4,620 points snuck its way into the highest tier yet. I think that it's time, after two things that were over 10 minutes long in a row, to discuss the last mode of this length, which incidentally is also the longest. That mode in question is Junior's The Closing Act. In the closing act, you have to figure out who out of the 6 animatronics is haunted. This can be done by checking for the lights flickering, Balloon Baby's stability being corrupted, the camera moving on its own, handprints being left behind, or, when one camera doesn't work, by looking for who is on a functional camera and therefore not haunted. If you use this knowledge with good checking on the cameras, then it should most of the time be fairly easy to slowly and surely figure the haunted one out before confirming your choice. Now, it is whilst dealing with that also important that you deal with every animatronic's stability. Said stability slowly goes down, makes you die when it runs out, limits the time you have to find who's haunted, and forces you to send an animatronic onto your conveyor belt to repair it. Now, with all of that said, there's one reason that this very weird mode placed as high on the list as it did, and it's the total length. Which is a deciding factor because you, for this challenge, don't have to guess who's haunted only once or twice or a bit more than that, but instead a total amount of 35 times. This amount alone makes the mode, for me at least, easily last between about 30 and 45 minutes, which makes it the longest thing on the entire list by like a mile. Add then, on top of that, you never being able to guess incorrectly once, and every animatronic loving to move in pairs, and you might wonder why this mode doesn't place even higher. The reason for that comes from the mode not having any form of threat that is immediately dangerous, which not just makes the mode somewhat relaxing, but also leads to it having some of the most lenient execution of any S tier mode. It is even with that still an absolute patience-based marathon to complete, but just not as hard as the length and other factors would maybe lead you to believe. Man, it's surprising how even though Candy's 3 has been snatching a total of 6 spots on the list, that it hasn't been present on the bonus spots at all so far. That absence, however, changes with our first spot in the lasting top 5, Five Nights at Candy's 3 Deluxe 10-10-10 mode with all challenges except laser pointer and no audio. This absolute mouthful of a challenge throws us against Rat, Cat, Vinny, and this game's version of Monstergami. Monster Rat works pretty much just like a slightly harder Shadow Rat from early on the list. Monster Cat slowly sneaks up on you and after a while enters an attack phase similar to Shadow Cat's where he steals your cassette. Monster Vinny works almost exactly like Puppet Master, with the only difference being that he already leaves after one bad sequence. And Monstergami plays some music to indicate his presence, where he just simply requires you to do one bad sequence with him. These four are paired up with the add-ons of Hard Cassette, which works like usual, and Faulty Flashlight, which forces you to decently often replace the batteries of your lights. They might sound scary, but really don't actually add that much to the difficulty. What does, however, add a lot to the difficulty is the third challenge of this mode, which is beating the entire night without any sound at all. This makes a massive difference for two reasons. The first reason is that you now can't hear Monstergami's music anymore, which forces you to pay close attention to if the cycle you just did was the last one in a chain. Editor's note: this is the last time, I promise. With a chain of cycles, I mean when two or more cycles happen directly after each other, like with Vinny, or when Monster Cat attacks before the current attack is over. In these specific cases, where attacks happen directly after each other, Monstergami doesn't appear because he only shows up after an attack that isn't directly followed by another. Thought I needed to explain that quickly, so let's get back to where we left off. And the second and also last reason is that you now can't hear the creaking on the bad sequence anymore, which makes it go from basically completely free to a blind timing with only about 2 seconds of leniency. So yeah, take the constant harassment by 4 different difficult enemies and pair that with a night length of 9 minutes, the Monstergami weirdness, and the need to do 6 super tight blind timings without fail, and it should be obvious how this manages to be the hardest Candy's free modes in the entire video. Doesn't place higher though, because the actual attack phases, whilst difficult, aren't even comparable to essentially anything higher up. Speaking of things that are higher up, I think that it's time to round out the S tier for the actually last time. The honor of doing this goes to the 4th hardest mode on the list, Five Nights at Chuck E. Cheese Rebooted but Worse 1020 mode, where we face off against these 10 Chuck E. Cheese related threats, who have to be countered in the following ways. Chuck E. Cheese plays an audio cue and forces you to fully close the gate. Classic Chuck E. Cheese forces you to half close the gate. Jasper, Helen Henny, and Pasquale all require the stage call to be used after respectively appearing in your face when you turn around, or, in Pasquale's case, when you put the monitor down. Mr. Munch has to be located on the cameras after leaving a stage. Munch Jr. has to be located and clicked when you exit the cameras. Krusty has to be simply avoided in the office. Dolly forces you to charge her piano. And Costume should be watched as much as possible if you like using your gates. These characters aren't that challenging on their own, but become a nightmare to deal with when paired together, because almost everyone takes a significant amount of time to be dealt with, in which you're locked into dealing with only that one threat. Dealing with anyone in your office forces you to first spend time on ridding both Munch Jr. and Pasquale, fending off Jasper locks you in place for a bit, and fully closing the gate takes an astounding 3 seconds. Pairing all of these 3 quirks together whilst matching them with the AI being specifically designed for many threats to appear in tandem leads to you very commonly being thrown against very tough combinations that require very good game knowledge and execution, the most infamous of which being between Jasper and Chuck E. Cheese. Again, which in combination lead to a scenario that, if you started dealing with Chuck E. Cheese too slowly, is literally impossible to survive. These interactions are the bread and butter of this mode and lead to it easily ending above all other bonus spots, but aren't in my opinion enough to make it go above the breakneck speed of Night 6, the external memory aspect of 3020 modes, or which is why this version of 1020 only made it to 4th. Man, we have finally finished the modes, even in S, and after over 50 minutes of video, it seems like we have actually done it. So, to recap this massive project, I think that it's time to quickly revisit the entire list, after which there might even be one more thing remaining. But before we get to that, these have been the first wave of my FNAF Fan Game achievements ranked by difficulty. I hope you enjoyed it, so far. Here we are at last. After over 9,500 words and over 20 pages of script, Jesus Christ, I can proudly say that we have reached the last thing of the entire video. Sitting right here at the very top above everything else is Animator's Hell Twisted 20 No Frisk Exploit. This final challenge not just has the highest amount of characters on the entire list, but also some very unique base mechanics that I'll quickly have to talk about for everything else to make sense. Basically, Animator's Hell has 3 camera systems that span over the main floor, the basement, and over your vents. Inside cameras, you can use an audio lure that takes a bit to recharge, and a camera deacon which on every usage takes away 1% power. On the basement camera, you also have the option to redirect power into the power generator, which linders your usage, into cameras B1 to B6, which activates night vision, or to camera B9, which inside camera turns the light on. Outside of that, there's also a temperature stat that goes up when certain enemies attack, and when the boiler in camera 6 breaks. That's all for the mechanic related stuff, so let's get to the characters. Sunny and Tornado need their respective vent to be shut after playing a second sound cue. Luna plays a laughing sound that requires you to close the vents. Ender forces you to flash away his tentacles. Spider spawns a small spider under your desk which has to be clicked. The Gemini twins appear in your office and require the correct mask fragment to be put on. Cortez has to be sometimes shined at after exiting your monitor. Shadows has to be every now and then flashed with the camera beacon. BW1 also has to be flashed with the camera beacon, becomes increasingly quicker over the night, and activates George after entering. George, after being activated, appears pretty rarely on your cameras and for the 3rd time now requires the beacon. Half Skull appears on the cameras and forces you to quickly put your monitor down. Pengeltang resides in camera 9 and gives you about 15 seconds to adjust his clock to the current in-game time. Fruki spawns every in-game hour and has to be found in one of the 6 night vision cameras. Pixel forces you to charge her over the night ever more quickly draining music box. Axie every now and then appears on camera 7 and forces you to tie some wires. Daisian makes you put the basement power mostly to B9. Frisk forces you to constantly use an audio lure in the right vent. Drago appears on the far right vent and there heightens the temperature by 10 degrees if you don't use the camera beacon. Oobleck heightens the temperature by 25 degrees until you use your water sprinkler. Nightmarina, after appearing, needs you to look at your cameras. And finally Evoc. Evoc simply kills you when your temperature is too high for an extended period of time. Now, the amount of characters with mostly different mechanics leads to one of Twisted 20's easily hardest aspects, which especially for the first couple of hours is just how insanely overwhelming the mode is. Like, you not just have to, similar to most other modes, watch the power, but also your temperature, the in-game time, multiple distinct sound cues, and the 2 enemies that are always active. But that's not all, because Twisted 20 on top of being confusing and overwhelming is also really learny due to not having a consistently repeatable gameplay loop. Think of how in Night 6 you only have to learn the loop of luring Mick, flashing face, erasing the notepad and then actually finding Mick, or how in 1320 you constantly change between finding classic photonegative Mickey and clearing out your office. These loops make the amount to learn a lot less, and Twisted 20 doesn't even remotely have something like that, because instead of having characters that appear in a consistent order, some characters are always active, some characters appear as the time shifts over, others pop up occasionally, and 4 get faster as the time progresses, which kinda makes everyone mix and jumble together in weird combinations. However, what if I tell you that that still isn't it? Because on top of all that, the power is also really strict, to a point where even a lot of well-played runs still end in a power outage. Overall, just so you get an idea of how much harder Twisted 20 is than 1320, I'd say that the difficulty jump from Treasure Island Night 6 now second guessing to Limbo is actually smaller than the jump from 1320 to this. Once you do put yourself through the grind, however, and you learn everything that this mode can throw at you, then the feeling of satisfaction when you finally do end up pulling through is just simply unrivaled. And so, this is it. I don't think that I've ever finished something with the same level of time invested in it. Like, when I started making this, it was originally supposed to be a 40 subscriber special, then a 50 subscriber special, and now that I'm releasing the entire thing, it has turned into a pretty late 100 subscriber special. Time has passed, and since then, or more strictly since the latter half of the bonus entries, I've actually beaten quite an enormous amount of things that weren't mentioned yet. But I won't cover those for now. That's a matter for a different time, a different me, and absolutely a different video. So, these have been the first 30 unique FNAF fan game modes that I have ever beaten. Thanks for watching. I think that I've been rambling here. for long enough.